I lay on an icy operating table and waited in despair for death to take me. Meanwhile, my husband, Arthur Roth, waited outside Shauna Green's operating theater. That I had tubes plugged into my body, and the beeping of the instruments around me made me feel like bells were chiming. They were telling me it was time to leave. As my ECG turned into a straight line, news of Shauna's surgery being a success came from the other operating theater. The light outside the operating theater went off, and my eyes shut forever. To my surprise, I appeared by Arthur's side in the form of a soul. Perhaps it was because I'd been left with overwhelming resentment when I died that I watched as he held Shauna in his arms, his eyes red with agitation now that she'd escaped death. My heart sank at the sight that I wanted to ask him whether he'd worried about me for even a second when Shauna and I had been wheeled into different operating theaters at the same time. But I suppose the answer was no. After all, he'd taken me to court over her illness. He'd hired the best lawyer in the industry to sue me, and I'd lost the case that I'd been in so much pain when getting my kidney removed that cold sweat had drenched my back. I called Arthur and pleaded, "I'm sorry, honey. Please don't take my kidney. It really hurts, and I feel like I'm going to die." I'd never adopted such a soft stance with Arthur before, and thought there was a chance he would let me off the hook if I were to admit defeat and take the blame for things I'd never done. We'd been together for 5 years, and I thought that would have meant something. However, he'd merely laughed cruelly over the phone. Admitting your mistakes is what is expected of you, and saving Shauna's life is your punishment. Don't even think about getting away with this, and don't think you don't have to apologize to her since you're giving her your kidney. Think about all the things you've done to hurt her over the years. I'll get even with you for that once she's better. Even if you want to die, you'll have to wait until after you've apologized. I tried to deny my involvement in the things he thought I'd done, but I was out of strength. Arthur didn't seem to think his rant was enough to vent his anger. He snarled, "You disgust me." He'd hung up after that, and my heart had plummeted into an abyss. My love for him went with it, that he claimed I disgusted him. But he'd been different when he'd married me. At the time, he'd lovingly told me he would love me for life. He'd also said I was his first choice, his only exception, and the only person he was partial to. However, he'd forgotten all about me once Shauna had come into the picture. Now that I was dead, I watched as Arthur gently stroked Shauna's face. It was as if she was a precious treasure. "Thank God you're alive. Thank God." He was choked up, and his bloodshot eyes told me he'd spent the night awake out of worry for her. Did it ever occur to him that I would be dead as he worried about her? Shauna cracked a weak smile. "I'm sorry for making you worry, Art. Where's Leona? Is she mad at me? I'll apologize to her right now." She struggled to prop herself up. Anyone who wasn't blind could see that she was faking it though. But of course, Arthur couldn't see it. Sure enough, he gently pushed her back onto the bed and caressed her head affectionately. "Silly you. Leona is the one who should apologize. What have you done wrong? You'll keep getting bullied if you're always so kind." A nurse couldn't help teasing them when she saw how they were acting. "You two are such a loving couple." She turned to Shauna. "Your husband waited in the corridor throughout the night during your surgery. He didn't step away even once." Shauna blushed shyly. Arthur stiffened for a split second, but didn't correct the misunderstanding. Just then the nurse sighed and said, "The patient who was in the operating theater beside yours wasn't as lucky as you though. She was alone when she was brought here, and none of her family members have come to collect her body. She's such a poor thing." After a brief silence, Arthur also sighed. "That really is pitiful." My gaze dimmed, and I smiled self-deprecatingly. Shauna was all he could see and think about. How could he possibly remember my existence? The conversation stopped there. Arthur and the nurse wheeled Shauna to her ward together. As they passed by the operating theater where my body was, he faltered and glanced inside. My body was still on the operating table. However, my feet faced the door, so no one could see my face. Still, if Arthur were to take a closer look, he would see the scar on my ankle. I'd gotten it when saving him in the past. After Arthur and Shauna disappeared into a hospital ward, Ian White ran into the hospital. He and Arthur missed each other. Ian held my hand tightly. Tears streamed down his face when his fingers brushed against my cold forehead as he tried to caress my hair. His voice shook as he said, Think about how good things would have been if you'd married me back then, you idiot. You wouldn't have ended up with no one bothering about you, even after your death. My nose prickled when I saw how windswept he looked. It seemed he'd just returned from out of town. He'd actually left this city after I'd married Arthur at the time. He'd given me 2 reasons for his departure. Firstly, he claimed Arthur couldn't stand him. Secondly, he said we would both be better off if he left because he didn't want to cause me unnecessary trouble. I was an orphan, and the White family had adopted me when I was 7. Ian was my adoptive brother. Initially, he hadn't liked me, but he'd become much nicer to me as time had passed. That I'd later cut ties with my adoptive parents due to my marriage with Arthur. The reason was simple. They wanted me to marry into a wealthier family. I knew they hadn't adopted me because of their affection for me. All they wanted was someone who could be a pawn and help them form an alliance through marriage. Compared to Arthur, there was no way I could marry Ian. At least my adoptive parents would never allow it. Ian took my body away. As he was leaving, Arthur came out of Shauna's hospital ward to get her some food. She'd asked him to get her some pastries from a bakery a distance away. He hadn't even hesitated upon hearing her request that I'd asked Arthur to get me food once too. All I'd wanted was something light from the convenience store downstairs. I'd asked him to get it for me on his way home, but he'd been too lazy to make a detour. Ian and Arthur ran into each other. Ian held my body, which was covered by a white sheet. Their gazes met, and they recognized each other. Get out of my way. Ian wasn't in the mood to be polite. It was to be expected. How could he be polite to someone who'd killed me? Arthur gave him a complex look before stepping aside. He wanted to show his respect for the dead, after all. However, his gaze landed on my ankle as Ian turned to leave. Hold it. Something seemed to occur to him. Who is this? My breathing hitched. I was afraid Ian would tell him about my death, but I was even more afraid he wouldn't. I looked forward to seeing Arthur's reaction once he learned I was dead. Ian only spoke after a brief silence. My wife. I was taken aback, and so was Arthur. He knew about my family situation, including Ian's feelings for me. When did you get married? He blurted. Then he looked surprised that he'd asked that. Ian sneered and retorted, I don't think that's any of your business, Mr. Roth. Arthur choked. Then he clapped back mockingly. You claim to like Leona, but I guess your feelings only went so far. Ian had already started walking away. He stopped and turned back to glance at Arthur. He said, well, I'm definitely lacking when compared to you. You've done much more to her than I ever did. The mockery in his tone was so evident that I doubted Arthur would miss out. As I floated after Ian, I turned back to look at Arthur. I felt like I didn't love him as much as I used to anymore. Arthur picked Shauna up from the hospital when she was discharged a month later. Ian had been the only one by my side after my death, but things were different for Shauna. Her hospital ward was crammed full of friends and family. They were all excited when Arthur arrived. When are you going to marry Shauna, Mr. Roth? She must be happy to see how much you treasure her, someone said. Shauna lowered her head shyly and said, don't say that. Art is already married, and I don't want Leona to get the wrong idea. I don't want to be a homewrecker either. She'll make things hard for me again if she hears about this. One of her friends mocked. I don't see what's so great about her when all she does is vie for attention out of jealousy. You're the one Arthur loves, not her. That makes her the third party in this relationship. All she's done so far is harm you. I would have divorced her ages ago if the choice was up to me. I found those words laughable. So, it turned out I was the one interfering with Arthur and Shauna's relationship. This was what Shauna did each time, though. She would use her words to make Arthur think I was at fault. But what hurt me the most was Arthur's attitude. He didn't say anything as he packed Shauna's things. There were so many people in the hospital ward, but none of them bothered helping. Also, he could do it. I thought about what my life had been like after I'd married Arthur. He'd claimed he would always love me, but I'd always been the one doing the housework and suffering grievances. I thought he would keep me safe from storms, but in hindsight, he'd been the cause of all my trouble. Shauna's been single all these years because of you, Mr. Roth. You can't let her down. One of Shauna's friends kept talking, and she pushed Arthur to Shauna in an attempt to matchmake them, but I watched them bitterly. It turned out this was how they spoke of me when I wasn't around. It seemed I was an unforgivable sinner in their eyes. Since Arthur hadn't said anything, I assumed he agreed with them. Arthur took Shauna back to his bachelor pad. It was a place he went to be alone whenever we argued. He'd never taken me there before, that I should have long since known that she was the true exception in his life. He could change all his principles for her. As he bent over to put her things away, she approached him and hugged him. My heart clenched at the sight. It hadn't been that long after my death, yet they were being so intimate. The way they acted around each other made it seem like Arthur wasn't a married man. To my surprise, he stiffened. He seemed to want to avoid her, but she only tightened her grip. She rested her head against his back and murmured, "Can you give me another chance, Art? I didn't mean to leave you back then. I would never have left after taking your father's money if my mother hadn't been sick." Oh, so she'd left after taking a life-saving sum, leading to a bad ending between them. It was such a typical story, yet Arthur had pined after her for so long. He laughed, but it was hard to read his emotions. "We wouldn't have ended up like this if you'd been honest with me. I could have given you the money my father did, couldn't I?" Shauna choked. Still, she was intelligent. She knew he despised me, so she dragged me into the fray. "You hate me, don't you? Is that why you didn't do anything when Leona bullied me? She hired someone to badmouth me at my company and got hooligans to violate me. They almost succeeded too. She even refused to donate her kidney to me despite knowing I needed it to survive. Is that how you want to get revenge on me?" She was lying. Shauna was lying through her teeth. Everything she said had never happened. I didn't even know where her company was. Besides, I was nothing but an orphan. How could I have had the influence to make some hooligans do my bidding? A simple investigation would be enough to expose Sean's dumb lies, but Arthur believed her. In fact, she'd been spouting nonsense when saying he hadn't done anything to me. Since learning what he thought was the truth, he dragged me out of my workplace with all my colleagues watching. His face had been so twisted with rage that it was almost as if I'd done something horrible. After that, he'd hired a group of gangsters to humiliate and beat me up. I'd curled up in a corner and trembled with despair as those men had taken improper photos of me. Arthur had watched the whole thing. Then he'd waved his phone before me and threatened, "Touch another hair on Shauna's head, and I'll spread these photos and videos online. I'll hold this against you forever." He turned a deaf ear to me when I'd repeatedly insisted that I hadn't done anything. He'd never believed me. Now Shauna was dredging up the past, but Arthur didn't say anything about how he'd tormented me because of her lies. It was ridiculous. I couldn't understand why he'd married me if he didn't love me. "Let's start over, Art. I'll act like you never married anyone else, and you can act like I never betrayed you. My love for you is genuine." Shauna softened her tone when she saw how serious Arthur looked. She'd always been a dab hand at coaxing and appeasing him, and he fell for it each time. In comparison, nothing I did would make him smile at me when he was angry. There really was a vast difference when a person loved and didn't love someone. I couldn't believe I'd been dumb enough to only realize it after my death. Arthur was always stoic and severe with me, but he was gentle and tender when he was with Shauna. He could also change his bottom line for her time and time again. My heart ached at the realization. Then again, I no longer cared how Shauna framed me or how much Arthur hated me. "You've just been discharged. You should rest." He pushed her away and avoided answering her question. Then he left. Shauna stomped angrily once Arthur was gone. Arthur returned to the apartment we shared. As he stood downstairs and looked up at the balcony, he realized it was pitch black inside. I'd always left a light on for him, no matter how late he returned, so that it would always light his path. He was evidently taken aback when he didn't see it on that night. He entered the apartment and was greeted by a chilly mustiness that came with the place being unoccupied for over a month. He frowned. "How much longer is your tantrum going to last, Leona? All I did was take you to court. I wouldn't have treated you like that if you didn't owe Shauna anything." He cried in the direction of the bedroom. His tone was filled with scorn and resentment. I followed him and sneered. It seemed the 5 years we'd spent together meant nothing when compared to another woman's false words. I was glad I was dead. Who knew how many more days of torment would await me if I were still alive? Who knew what else Arthur was capable of if he could kill me for Shauna's sake? He searched the apartment for me but didn't find me. He only saw the dishes I'd prepared before being taken to the hospital. They were moldy after being left out for so long, so it was hard to tell what they'd originally been. That day happened to be our 5th wedding anniversary. I'd waited for him to return, but all I'd gotten was a court order to undergo surgery. I didn't even need to ask to know that Arthur had been busy comforting Shauna, who was about to be reborn. She'd told him she was afraid of undergoing surgery, so he'd held her hand tightly and told her not to be scared. He'd prayed for her survival as I faced death and needed him by my side. Arthur scowled at the mess on the table and pulled out his phone to call me. I didn't know how many times he dialed my number. He was rarely this stubborn. To be accurate, he'd never called me unless absolutely necessary. He was unexpectedly patient today, but none of his calls to me would ever be answered anymore. When he realized I wasn't answering, he sent me a voice message on WhatsApp. "Haven't you had enough of this, Leona? Do you realize what a mess the house is? How could you have run away before I settled the score with you? I'll give you an hour to get the hell back here, or we're getting a divorce." A divorce? That was a good idea. I probably would have agreed to it if he'd asked me for one in the past. At least I wouldn't have ended up dead. Soon his phone vibrated. His eyes lit up before dimming again when he saw that it was just a text from Shauna. I didn't know whether my eyes were playing tricks on me though. "I left something at the hospital, Art. Could you help me get it?" Arthur immediately replied with an "okay." After putting on his coat, he paused at the door and turned to look back at the apartment, his gaze unfathomable that I smiled bitterly. It was late at night, yet he was still willing to do what Shauna asked of him. Once I'd gotten a bad stomachache in the middle of the night and begged him to take me to the hospital, but he'd complained about it being too far that it seemed it wasn't that far anymore. He drove to the hospital and went to the ward Shauna had occupied. That was when he ran into a nurse that I recognized her. She'd been beside me during my surgery. She'd seen the live stream of my court case on TV and pitied me. She scoffed when she saw Arthur. My, has it finally occurred to you to look for your wife? She already died during the surgery." He faltered and looked at her in disbelief. "What did you say? Who's dead?" She looked at him like he was an idiot. "Your wife, Leona Barton. Honestly, I don't know how you can call yourself her husband. You forced her to donate her kidney when she already had kidney failure. What is that if not murder?"